The Boeing 777 leveled at 37,000 feet, its passengers settling into the rhythm of transatlantic flight 447. Dr. Alina Vasquez adjusted her reading light, fingers tracing the worn spine of her aerodynamics textbook. Seat 6A offered the perfect view of the wing, though she'd chosen it more for solitude than scenery. The businessman beside her had already dismissed her with a glance. Just another academic heading to a conference, he'd assumed. If only he knew. The first sign of trouble wasn't the turbulence that rattled overhead bins or the captain's slightly strained voice over the intercom. It was the way flight attendant Jessica Martinez's eyes swept the cabin with barely concealed urgency, her professional smile wavering as she moved methodically down the aisle. Alina caught fragments of hushed conversation from the galley. Unprecedented situation, and need to verify. Then came the announcement that would change everything. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison. We're experiencing some technical difficulties that require immediate attention. Flight attendants, please report to stations immediately. The words carried an undercurrent of controlled panic that made Alina's pulse quicken. She'd heard that tone before, in briefing rooms where lives hung in the balance. Jessica appeared at her elbow, voice barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, could you please come with me? The captain needs to speak with you urgently." Alina's mind raced through possibilities. Mistaken identity, medical emergency requiring her physics expertise. But as they moved toward the cockpit, she glimpsed the flight attendant's trembling hands. The cockpit door opened to reveal Captain Morrison's grim face, his co-pilot frantically working controls that seemed to respond with increasing reluctance. Morrison's eyes found hers immediately. "Dr. Vasquez, I need you to tell me everything about your military background, right now." Alina felt the familiar weight of expectation, the same gravity that had followed her through 2 tours in Afghanistan, through countless hours piloting warthogs through hostile airspace. "How did you?" "Your frequent flyer profile flagged when we ran passenger manifests. Says you're former Air Force. What they didn't say is what you really flew." Morrison's hands gripped the yoke as the aircraft shuddered. "Because right now, we've got hydraulic failure in 2 systems, our fly-by-wire is glitching, and we're carrying 300 souls toward the middle of the Atlantic. The emergency protocols are failing, and frankly, Dr. Vasquez, you might be our only hope." Alina stared at the instrument panel, its red warnings painting the cockpit in hellish light. Outside, the vast ocean stretched endlessly below, indifferent to human prayers. Captain Morrison's briefing came in staccato bursts between system alarms. "Primary hydraulics failed 20 minutes ago. Backup system is operating at 30% capacity. Fly-by-wire computers are giving contradictory inputs. We're getting phantom commands that don't match our control inputs." His weathered hands moved across switches with practiced precision, but Alina could see the fear behind his professional composure. Co-pilot James Chen looked up from his console, sweat beading his forehead despite the cockpit's cool air. "Alina, Dr. Vasquez, we've tried everything in the manual. The aircraft is becoming increasingly unstable. We're maintaining altitude, but..." He gestured helplessly at the cascade of warning lights. Alina studied the primary flight display, her mind automatically processing airspeed, altitude, heading indicators. The numbers told a story of impending catastrophe wrapped in technical precision. "Show me exactly what happened when the failures began," she said, settling into the jump seat behind Morrison. "Started with a minor hydraulic pressure drop on the number 2 system," Morrison explained, his voice steady despite their circumstances. "Standard procedure called for backup activation. That's when things got ugly. The fly-by-wire system started interpreting our control inputs incorrectly. When we pull back on the yoke, sometimes we get nose-down response." Alina's blood chilled. She'd seen similar scenarios during her time flying A-10 Thunderbolts over Kandahar province, where system failures could mean the difference between returning to base or becoming another casualty statistic. But those were single-seat attack aircraft built for punishment. This was a commercial airliner carrying innocents. "Have you contacted air traffic control?" she asked. Chen nodded grimly. "We declared an emergency 40 minutes ago. They've cleared us priority routing to Shannon Airport in Ireland, closest suitable runway, but at our current rate of system degradation. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Alina leaned forward, studying the multifunction displays with the intensity that had once helped her identify surface-to-air missile threats from 30,000 feet. "Captain, with your permission, I'd like to try something, but I need to know exactly how much control authority you actually have right now." Morrison met her eyes in the reflection of the instrument panel. "Honestly, we're flying by feel more than instrumentation. The computer keeps fighting us, trying to correct for problems that don't exist while ignoring the ones that do." Outside the cockpit windows, the afternoon sun painted the ocean in deceptive beauty. Alina thought of her passengers, probably still unaware of how desperately their situation had deteriorated. In seat 6A, her textbook lay forgotten, its pages filled with theories about lift and drag that seemed academic compared to the brutal reality of keeping 340,000 pounds of aluminum and humanity aloft through pure determination. The radio crackled with Shannon Control's Irish-accented voice. "Transatlantic 447, be advised we have emergency crews standing by. What's your current fuel status and estimated time of arrival?" Morrison keyed the microphone. "Shannon Control, fuel is adequate for approach, but we're experiencing severe control difficulties. Request priority vectors and emergency services on standby." His professional calm never wavered, even as Alina noticed his knuckles white against the controls. Alina closed her eyes briefly, feeling the aircraft's subtle movements through the seat, reading its mechanical language the way she'd once read the mood of her A-10 during combat missions over hostile terrain. Every aircraft had its own personality, its own way of communicating distress. This Boeing was screaming. "Captain," she said quietly, "I think I know what might help, but it's going to require us to essentially fly this bird like a fighter jet, manual inputs, ignoring most of what the computers are telling us and trusting our instincts over the instruments." Morrison turned to face her fully for the first time. "Dr. Vasquez, exactly what kind of aircraft did you fly in the Air Force?" Alina's lips curved in a grim smile. "A-10 Warthogs, close air support. The kind of flying where you get one chance to get it right, and if you don't, people die." She paused, watching his expression. "I had a call sign, Ghost, because I could make 30 tons of ugly aircraft dance like a ballerina when everything else was falling apart." The cockpit fell silent except for the persistent alarm chimes. Chen stared at her with new understanding, while Morrison's expression shifted from desperation to something resembling hope. "Ghost," he repeated softly. "Jesus, you're that Ghost, the pilot who—" "Stories for another time, Captain. Right now, we need to get these people home." Alina moved to the center console, her hands hovering over controls she hadn't touched in civilian aviation, but understood with muscle memory forged in combat. "First thing we do is isolate the problematic fly-by-wire systems. We're going to fly this approach old school, stick and rudder, visual references, and a lot of prayer." The transformation was immediate. As Alina began systematically disabling automated systems that were fighting their inputs, the aircraft's schizophrenic behavior started to stabilize. Morrison felt it first, the yoke responding more predictably to his inputs, the nose tracking truer to his commands. "Shannon Control, Transatlantic 447, Alina spoke into the headset with calm authority. "We're going to need a straighten approach to your longest runway. No turns, no complicated vectors. Just point us at the concrete and give us room to work." "Transatlantic 447, that would be runway 24. Length 11,000 feet, currently clear. Winds light and variable. You're cleared straight in, maintain heading 240. Alina nodded to Morrison. "Captain, I'm going to talk you through this approach like we're flying formation. Trust your hands more than your head. The aircraft wants to fly. We just need to stop fighting it and start working with it." As they began their descent toward Ireland, Alina found herself transported back to the mountains of Afghanistan, where she'd guided damaged A-10s back to base using nothing but instinct and determination. But this time, the stakes felt infinitely higher. In her warthog, the only life in her hands had been her own. Today, she carried the hopes of 300 strangers who'd never know how close they'd come to catastrophe. The Atlantic Ocean stretched below them, gradually giving way to the emerald coastline of Ireland. In the distance, Shannon Airport's runway lights began to twinkle in the approaching dusk, a lifeline stretching across the landscape like a promise of salvation. "Gear down," Alina instructed, monitoring the hydraulic pressure gauges. "We've got enough pressure for one shot at this. No go-around, no second chances." Morrison's hands moved with newfound confidence, the aircraft responding to his touch like a willing partner instead of an adversary. For the first time since the crisis began, Alina allowed herself to believe they might actually make it. The approach to Shannon Airport unfolded with mathematical precision that belied the chaos of the previous hours. Alina's voice remained steady as she guided Morrison through each phase of the descent, her instructions carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd faced death and emerged victorious. "Airspeed 160 knots, rate of descent 700 feet per minute," she called out, eyes scanning the instruments while simultaneously monitoring the aircraft's behavior through subtle vibrations and control responses. "You're doing beautifully, Captain. The aircraft is talking to us now instead of fighting us." Through the cockpit windows, the Irish countryside spread below them in patchwork fields and stone walls that spoke of centuries of human persistence. Alina thought briefly of her grandmother, who'd left County Cork decades ago with nothing but hope and determination, traits that had somehow filtered down through generations to manifest in this moment. Chen worked frantically at his station, configuring systems for landing while monitoring their remaining hydraulic pressure. "Pressure holding steady at 28%, he reported. "Should be sufficient for landing, but we won't have normal braking authority." "Shannon Control, be advised we'll need maximum rollout distance," Alina transmitted. "Our braking capability is severely compromised. Have emergency crews positioned accordingly." The Irish controller's voice came back calm and reassuring. "Transatlantic 447, emergency services are in position. Runway 24 is cleared and waiting for you. Winds now calm. You're cleared to land." Morrison's breathing had steadied, his movements becoming more fluid as he internalized Alina's guidance. "I can feel it," he said quietly. "The aircraft wants to fly straight and level. It's the computers that were making it unstable." "Exactly," Alina confirmed. "In combat, we learn to read our aircraft like they were extensions of our own bodies. Trust what you feel through the controls, not just what the instruments tell you." As they crossed the threshold at Shannon, Alina felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that had once carried her through surface-to-air missile attacks and emergency landings on damaged runways. But this time, the satisfaction was deeper, more profound. This wasn't about military objectives or strategic targets. This was about bringing people home to their families. The main landing gear touched down with surprisingly gentle precision, followed seconds later by the nose wheel. Morrison held the centerline perfectly as the aircraft rolled down runway 24, emergency vehicles racing alongside with lights blazing and foam equipment at the ready. "Welcome to Ireland, Transatlantic 447, Shannon Control transmitted with unmistakable relief. "Outstanding work, crew." As the Boeing finally came to a complete stop, the cockpit fell silent except for the sound of 3 people breathing deeply, processing what they'd just accomplished. Chen was first to speak. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, we actually did it." Alina unbuckled her harness and stood, feeling the weight of responsibility finally lifting from her shoulders. Through the passenger cabin windows, she could see emergency crews surrounding the aircraft while passengers pressed their faces to windows, many wiping away tears they probably didn't understand. Morrison turned to face her fully, his expression mixing exhaustion with profound gratitude. "Ghost," he said simply. "That call sign fits. You appeared out of nowhere and saved 300 lives." Alina shook her head. "We all saved 300 lives, Captain. You and Chen did the flying. I just helped translate what the aircraft was trying to tell you." But even as she spoke, Alina knew this moment would follow her forever, joining the collection of memories that defined who she was and who she'd become. The aftermath unfolded with the controlled chaos typical of aviation emergencies successfully resolved. Passengers evacuated via slides deployed as a precaution, though most were walking and talking, their relief palpable in the cool Irish evening air. Alina found herself swept along with the crowd, just another passenger in the eyes of emergency personnel, her crucial role known only to the flight crew. As she stood on the tarmac watching paramedics check passengers for injuries that thankfully seemed minor, mostly bumps and bruises from the evacuation, Alina felt a familiar mixture of satisfaction and melancholy that always followed intense situations. The adrenaline was fatting, leaving behind the hollow feeling that came when extraordinary circumstances returned to ordinary reality. "Dr. Vasquez?" A voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find Captain Morrison approaching, his uniform disheveled but his bearing still professional. Behind him walked Chen, flanked by what appeared to be aviation safety investigators and airline executives. "The Aviation Safety Authority wants to debrief everyone involved," Morrison explained. "Your role in this? Well, let's just say there are going to be a lot of questions about how an aerodynamics professor ended up essentially co-piloting a commercial airliner through a critical emergency." Alina nodded, having expected this moment. Military training never really left you. There was always an after-action report, always someone who needed to understand exactly what happened and why. "I'll cooperate fully with any investigation, Captain." One of the investigators, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an Irish accent, stepped forward. "Dr. Vasquez, I'm Sarah Kelly with the Irish Aviation Authority. What you did today? Well, preliminary reports suggest you may have prevented one of the worst aviation disasters in recent memory. We'd like to understand your background and exactly how you identified solutions that our best engineers are still trying to figure out." As they walked toward the terminal building, Alina caught glimpses of news crews setting up equipment, their cameras already capturing footage of the disabled aircraft surrounded by emergency vehicles. She realized that within hours, this story would be international news. The thought made her uncomfortable. She'd always preferred operating in shadows, where competence spoke louder than publicity. "Captain Morrison," she said quietly as they entered the terminal's fluorescent lighting. "I'd prefer to keep my role as minimal as possible in any public statements. I was just a passenger who happened to have relevant experience." Morrison stopped walking and faced her directly. "Ghost, with respect, that's not going to be possible. What you did today transcended being a helpful passenger. You essentially took command of a crisis situation and guided us through solutions that saved hundreds of lives. People are going to want to know who you are." Alina sighed, recognizing the inevitable. Her years of flying under the radar, literally and figuratively, were about to end. The quiet academic life she'd built since leaving the Air Force was going to be complicated by questions she'd hoped never to face again. As they settled into a conference room for the initial debriefing, Alina's phone buzzed with a text message. The number was unfamiliar, but the message made her blood freeze. "Saw the news reports. Always knew you'd surface eventually. We need to talk, M." Only one person had ever signed messages that way. Colonel Marcus Webb, her former commanding officer, the man who'd recruited her for missions that officially never existed. If Webb was reaching out now, it meant her involvement in Flight 447 had attracted attention from places she'd hoped never to deal with again. The debriefing sessions stretched deep into the evening, with investigators meticulously reconstructing every decision and action from the moment the emergency began. Alina answered their questions with clinical precision, describing her analysis of the aircraft systems and the reasoning behind each recommendation she'd made to the flight crew. "What strikes me most," said Dr. Michael Brennan, the lead investigator, "is how quickly you diagnosed problems that our preliminary analysis suggests would have taken a team of engineers hours to identify. Your background is in aerodynamics research, not commercial aviation systems troubleshooting." Alina chose her words carefully. My military experience included flying aircraft with similar fly-by-wire complications. The A-10, while obviously different from a Boeing 777, taught me to recognize when automated systems become adversaries rather than aids. Chen, who'd been quietly taking notes, looked up sharply. You flew A-10s? Those are ground attack fighters, single-seat combat missions. His voice trailed off as understanding dawned. You weren't just Air Force, you were combat Air Force. The room fell silent as the investigators processed this information. Alina could see them recalculating their understanding of who she was and what her presence on Flight 447 really meant. Inspector Kelly leaned forward. Dr. Vasquez, our preliminary investigation suggests that without your intervention, this aircraft would likely have been lost with all souls aboard. The combination of hydraulic failure and fly-by-wire conflicts was creating an unrecoverable situation. Yet you identified solutions that seem almost intuitive in hindsight. Can you explain how? Alina stared out the conference room window at the disabled Boeing, still surrounded by investigation teams and portable lighting. In combat aviation, you learn that aircraft are living things. They communicate through vibrations, sounds, the feel of controls in your hands. When systems fail, the aircraft tries to tell you what's wrong, but you have to know how to listen. She paused, memories of Afghanistan missions flooding back. Today, that Boeing was screaming for help. The computers were trying to solve problems that didn't exist while ignoring the real crisis. Sometimes the most sophisticated solution is to turn off the sophistication and fly by instinct. Dr. Brennan nodded thoughtfully. Your approach essentially bypassed decades of aviation safety automation to return to fundamental piloting principles. Because sometimes, Alina said quietly, the most advanced technology becomes the biggest obstacle to survival. As the formal debriefing concluded near midnight, Alina found herself alone with Morrison and Chen in the terminal's nearly empty departure lounge. The adrenaline had long since faded, leaving behind exhaustion and the strange disconnection that followed intense experiences. I need to ask you something, Morrison said, settling into an uncomfortable plastic chair. When you were guiding us through that approach, there was a moment, maybe 20 minutes out from touchdown, where you went completely calm. Like ice calm. Chen and I both felt it. What was that about? Alina considered the question, remembering the moment he meant. It had been when Shannon Control reported emergency vehicles were in position, when the reality of either succeeding completely or failing catastrophically crystallized into absolute clarity. It's called combat focus, she said finally. When you're flying close air support missions, there's a point where all the variables collapse into a single moment of truth. You either execute perfectly or people die. There's no middle ground, no partial success. In that moment, everything becomes very simple. Chen shook his head slowly. I've been flying commercial aviation for 15 years. I've never experienced anything like what happened today, not just the emergency, but the way you handled it. It was like watching someone operate in a completely different reality. Different training, Alina corrected. In the Air Force, we practiced emergency scenarios until our responses became automatic. But more than that, we practiced making life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure until that pressure became just another environmental factor to manage. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, staring at the terminal's departure boards showing delayed and canceled flights. Ghost, he said finally, can I ask why you left the military? Someone with your skills. Alina's phone buzzed again. Another message from Webb. Offer still stands. Your country could use someone like you. She silenced the phone and looked at both men. I left because I wanted to save lives by building better aircraft, not by flying them in combat. Today reminded me that maybe the most important thing isn't what you're trained to do, but what you choose to do when circumstances demand everything you've got. Outside the terminal windows, the sun was beginning to rise over Shannon Airport, painting the sky in soft pastels that belied the intensity of the previous day's events. The disabled Boeing sat silently on the runway, surrounded by investigation equipment and technical teams, a testament to both human vulnerability and human capability. The media attention erupted with the intensity Alina had dreaded. By morning, news outlets across Europe and North America were running stories about the mystery pilot who had emerged from passenger seating to help save Flight 447. Airport security escorted her through crowds of reporters shouting questions about her military service, her role in the emergency, and what she planned to do next. Dr. Vasquez, can you comment on reports that you're a decorated combat veteran? Is it true you flew attack aircraft in Afghanistan? What made you decide to leave the military for academic research? Alina kept her head down and her responses minimal, but she could feel the weight of attention that would follow her back to her carefully constructed quiet life. Her phone had been ringing constantly since dawn, reporters, aviation experts, and numbers she recognized from her military past. The flight back to Boston was surreal. Passengers recognized her from news reports, flight attendants whispered and pointed, and the captain made a special announcement acknowledging her presence aboard. Alina stared out the window, watching the Atlantic Ocean pass below and thinking about how quickly life could change direction. At Logan Airport, more reporters waited. Alina's department head from MIT had sent a car, but even that couldn't completely shield her from the chaos. As they drove through Boston traffic toward Cambridge, Alina's phone rang with a number she'd been expecting and dreading. "Hello, Marcus," she answered without looking at the display. Colonel Webb's voice was exactly as she remembered, calm, measured, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Alina, saw the news. Interesting way to announce to the world that Ghost is still operational." "I'm not operational, Marcus. I'm a professor. I teach aerodynamics to graduate students and publish papers about wind tunnel testing. That's all." "Is it? Because what I saw on the news looked very much like the officer I used to know, the one who could make impossible decisions under pressure and bring everyone home alive." Alina closed her eyes, feeling the familiar tug of responsibility that had defined her military career. "What do you want, Marcus?" "Same thing I've always wanted. Your country needs pilots who can think beyond conventional solutions. The threats we're facing now make Afghanistan look simple. We need people who can adapt, improvise, and lead when everything conventional fails. I left that world for a reason. And yesterday proved you can never really leave it. Alina, you saved 300 lives because you are who you are, not despite it. Don't you think there might be other situations where that combination of skills could make a difference?" The car pulled up to her apartment building in Cambridge, its red brick facade offering the promise of routine and anonymity that now seemed impossibly distant. Alina could see reporters already stationed outside, cameras ready to capture her return to civilian life. "I need time to think, Marcus." "Time is what we don't have much of these days, but take what you need. You know how to reach me when you're ready." As Alina climbed the stairs to her third-floor apartment, she passed neighbors she'd known for 3 years who now looked at her with new eyes, curiosity, respect, and something that might have been awe. The quiet professor who jogged through the neighborhood each morning had become someone else overnight, whether she wanted it or not. Her apartment felt smaller somehow, filled with artifacts from her carefully compartmentalized life. Aviation textbooks shared shelf space with military memoirs she hadn't opened in years. On her desk sat a framed photo from her last day of active duty, herself and her ground crew standing beside her A-10, all of them grinning at the camera with the casual confidence of people who'd survived what they'd never expected to survive. Alina picked up the photo, studying faces she hadn't thought about in months. 3 of those men had been killed in action after she'd left. The aircraft in the background, tail number 810965, the Warthog she'd flown for 2 combat tour, had been retired and sent to a museum in Arizona. Her laptop chimed with an email from the MIT administration. The subject line read, "Media requests and administrative leave options." Alina deleted it without reading the contents. She knew what it said. Her department was being overwhelmed with interview requests, and they were offering her time off to deal with the situation. But as she stood in her quiet apartment, surrounded by the trappings of academic life, Alina realized that the person who had awakened in seat 6A of Flight 447 might not be content to return to the person who had gone to sleep there. The knock on her door came just after sunset. Alina looked through the peephole to see a familiar face, Captain Morrison, out of uniform and looking oddly informal in civilian clothes. "Captain," she said, opening the door, "this is unexpected." "Jim," he corrected, "and I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I got your address from the airline's emergency contact database. Probably shouldn't have, but—" He shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "I had to talk to you." Alina gestured him inside, noting how his eyes moved over her apartment, taking in the aviation textbooks, the military memorabilia, the careful organization that spoke of someone accustomed to living with precision. "How are you handling all this?" Jim asked, settling onto her couch. "Media attention was never my strong suit," Alina admitted. "I preferred operating in shadows. This level of visibility is challenging." Jim nodded understandingly. "The airline wants to give you some kind of commendation. Chen and I have been asked to participate in a ceremony recognizing your actions. I wanted to check with you first, make sure it's something you'd be comfortable with." Alina walked to her kitchen window, looking out at the Charles River where evening rowers practiced their strokes in mechanical precision. "Honestly, Jim, I just want to get back to normal life. What happened on that flight was just circumstances. Any pilot with similar experience would have done the same thing." "That's where you're wrong," Jim said firmly. "I've been flying for 22 years. I've worked with military pilots, test pilots, flight instructors, the whole spectrum of aviation professionals. What you did wasn't just about experience. It was about character." Alina turned to face him. "What do you mean?" "You took responsibility for 300 lives that weren't your responsibility. You could have stayed in your seat, let us work through our procedures, and if things went bad, well, you'd have been just another passenger. Instead, you stood up when standing up meant accepting total accountability for the outcome." Jim leaned forward, his expression intense. "That's not training, Alina. That's who you are, and the world needs more people like that, especially now." As if summoned by his words, Alina's phone rang. Marcus Webb again. She let it go to voicemail, but the message was clear. Some choices couldn't be avoided forever. That night, Alina dreamed of flying. Not the careful, controlled flight of commercial aviation, but the raw, visceral experience of combat flying, dancing with death at 300 knots, making split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. She woke with the taste of adrenaline in her mouth and the sound of jet engines echoing in her ears. Standing at her bathroom mirror, Alina studied her reflection. The woman looking back had the same face, the same dark eyes, the same scar along her left temple from a hard landing in Kandahar province. But something had changed in those eyes, a recognition that the person she'd tried to become and the person she actually was might not be the same thing. Her phone showed 17 missed calls from reporters, 3 from MIT administration, and 1 from Marcus Webb. There was also a text from a number she didn't recognize. "Dr. Vasquez, this is Chen from Flight 447. The crew is meeting for coffee this morning at 10 a.m. if you'd like to join us. No media, no officials, just the people who were there. Corner Cafe on Newbury Street if you're interested." Alina stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "I'll be there." As she dressed for the meeting, Alina found herself choosing clothes carefully. Not the casual academic attire she'd worn for years, but something that spoke to both sides of her identity. Dark jeans, a leather jacket, and boots that had once been standard issue. Looking in the mirror, she saw glimpses of the Air Force officer she'd been, integrated with the professor she'd become. The walk to Newbury Street gave her time to think. Boston was beautiful in the morning light, its brick sidewalks and historic architecture speaking to continuity and tradition. But Alina found herself noticing other things too: sight lines, crowd patterns, potential threats, observations that belonged to a different version of herself. The corner cafe was exactly what she'd expected: a small, intimate space with mismatched furniture and the kind of atmosphere that invited quiet conversation. Jim Morrison sat at a corner table with Chen and Jessica Martinez, the flight attendant who'd first approached Alina's seat. All three looked up as she entered, their expressions mixing relief and something deeper, the bond that forms between people who have faced death together and emerged victorious. "Ghost," Jim said simply, using her call sign like a greeting. As Alina joined them at the table, she realized this was the first time since leaving the military that anyone had called her by that name, without explanation or context. These people understood who she was not because of her credentials or her academic achievements, but because they'd seen her in action when everything else had failed. The conversation started carefully, touching on recovery from the incident and media attention, but gradually deepened into something more meaningful. Chen talked about how the experience had changed his perspective on flying, how he'd started questioning automation systems he'd trusted without thought for 15 years. Jessica described the passengers' reactions, their initial confusion, then growing awareness that something serious was happening, and finally their profound gratitude when they learned how close they'd come to disaster. "They keep asking me about you," she told Alina. "Who you were, how you knew what to do. I tell them you were an angel in seat." Alina shook her head. "I was just someone with relevant experience who happened to be in the right place." Jim studied her carefully over his coffee cup. "Alina, can I ask you something personal?" She nodded. "Why did you really leave the Air Force? And don't give me the standard answer about wanting to contribute to civilian aviation. Someone with your skills, your record, there had to be more to it." Alina was quiet for a long moment, watching steam rise from her cup. "I left because I was tired of making decisions about who lived and who died. In close air support, every mission meant choosing targets, calculating acceptable losses, weighing the value of objectives against the cost in human lives. I thought academic research would let me contribute to aviation without carrying that weight." She looked around the table at three people who were alive, because she'd been willing to carry that weight one more time. "But I'm starting to realize that maybe the weight isn't something you can set down. Maybe it's something you learn to carry more gracefully." Chen leaned forward. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that yesterday reminded me why I became a pilot in the first place. It wasn't about the technology or the thrill of flying. It was about being able to help people when they needed help most." Alina's phone buzzed with yet another call from Webb. This time, instead of letting it ring, she answered. "Hello, Marcus." "Alina, I was beginning to think you were avoiding me." "I've been thinking about your offer." "And?" Alina looked around the table at three people who represented the best of civilian aviation, professionals who did their jobs with competence and dedication, serving passengers who trusted them with their lives every day. She thought about the hundreds of people who'd walked away from Flight 447 because someone had been willing to take responsibility when responsibility mattered most. "I want to meet," Alina said, "but not about returning to active duty. I want to talk about something else, a way to bridge the gap between military and civilian aviation, to share the kind of crisis management skills that could prevent disasters before they become headlines." Webb was quiet for a moment. "That's not exactly what I had in mind." "It's what I have in mind, Marcus. Take it or leave it." "All right, let's talk." As Alina ended the call, she realized that the three people at the table were staring at her with new understanding. She wasn't just the passenger who'd helped save Flight 447. She was someone actively choosing how to use the second chance that survival had given her. "What happens now?" Jessica asked quietly. Alina smiled, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since her last day in uniform. "Now we figure out how to make sure what happened to us never happens to anyone else." The meeting with Webb took place 3 days later at a nondescript office building in Arlington, Virginia. Alina arrived early and sat in the parking garage, watching federal employees come and go with their ID badges and purposeful strides. She'd once been part of this world, moving through secured hallways where decisions were made that shaped global events. Webb looked exactly as she remembered: salt and pepper hair, penetrating blue eyes, and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His office was spartanly furnished, with maps covering one wall and a single photo on his desk, showing him with a group of pilots Alina recognized as former squadron mates. "You look good," he said by way of greeting. "Civilian life agrees with you." "It did until 3 days ago," Alina replied, settling into the chair across from his desk. Webb smiled grimly. "Alina, what happened on Flight 447 is already having ripple effects. The aviation industry is asking questions about emergency training, about the gaps between military and civilian crisis response capabilities. Your name is being mentioned in very high places." "Which is exactly what I was hoping to avoid. But maybe what the country needs you to embrace." Webb leaned forward. "What you're proposing, this bridge between military and civilian aviation, it's actually something we've been discussing at the policy level. The threats facing commercial aviation are evolving. Cyber attacks on flight management systems, increasingly sophisticated terrorism, mechanical failures complicated by over-reliance on automation." Alina studied his expression. "What are you,